please give a warm welcome to Father Tad Colton.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Well, it's a great pleasure to be with you today. Thanks for coming out for this. I think you'll agree that this topic that we're going to try to tackle today, it's just kind of everywhere. So, on a recent Amtrak train trip that I went on, we were greeted by the conductor with this announcement. Ladies and gentlemen, and all those non-binary, welcome to Amtrak train number 178. So, I realized that this had truly gone mainstream. Some of you may have seen announcements or posters like this, with the long listing of acronyms, so many that they multiply, and it is challenging even to keep up with the number of these new designations. This was from a training session being held in Canada. So I don't want to get kind of bogged down in terminology, but I think it's important to clarify a few terms. When we talk about gender identity, this would be a person's perception of being male or female. They claim this is their identity, I identify as such and so. Meanwhile, gender dysphoria would be the distress that you feel when your gender identity differs from your sex, from your biological sex. This word dysphoria, it's sounds technical. I had never heard this word probably prior to 2014 or 2015. And the definition, it's actually a psychiatric term. It's a state of unease or generalized dissatisfaction with life, and it's the opposite of euphoria. Euphoria is that great feeling that you get. Dysphoria is kind of this, dissonance and downer feeling or distress. All right, so if we have to summarize the central misconception about gender that's really at the heart of all of these debates, whether you are a man or a woman, a boy or a girl, is more of a disposition or feeling about yourself than a fact of nature. That's the kind of claim that is being put forward. My feelings here need to govern the discussion. However, our sex, like our genes, like our race, like our age, and other natural characteristics, are objective givens, not subjective choices that we simply make randomly. So I want to quote from an old document that I ran into that came out of the Vatican way back in 1975. It wasn't dealing with transgender stuff at all, but I thought it had a quote that just hit the nail on the head here. It was from a document called On the Human Person. Therefore, there can be no true promotion of man's dignity unless the essential order of his nature is respected. And of course, dignity is at the heart of our concerns here. We want to get this right. We want to treat others in full dignity, the dignity of their real status as human persons. But it's key that we do this in an authentic way. So and that involves respecting that order of our nature. All right, so I mentioned kind of the cultural overview. I want to say a few words about how this has been playing out in our society, and who better to start with than Bruce Jenner. I remember growing up and hearing about him and following him, and he was kind of the all-American guy. He was a guy's guy, a man's man, it seemed. Sort of the quintessence, if you will, of masculinity. And you may recall in the Olympics, he was in the decathlon, these 10 different events that the people had to run through, the competitors had to go through, and he just really did an incredible showing. So I have a video from an ABC News report, came out a few years ago, that I think captured this.
those hundreds of millions of people who once cheered a real-life American superhero. The Olympics, 1976. He came to compete in the decathlon, 10 events inspired by the ancient Greeks as the highest test of human endurance and raw masculine power. The challenge of speed, stamina, daring, brute strength, precision, then speed again. There he is, flying over the hurdles, breaking his personal record on the shot put, an explosive throw in the discus.
Let it go a little soon, and it all...
In the ninth event, the javelin hurtles toward the horizon.
In the decathlon, the body is screaming for mercy. It's another good one. It's got to be a good one. It's beyond 220 feet.
And then, the 10th and final event, forced to run yet again.
And Jenner is coming hard.
His competitors go down, writhing in agony.
There's the pain of the decathlon.
Bruce Jenner takes a victory lap, unbowed. His crown will be that sentence that can only be used for the champion of this event. He has just been proclaimed the greatest athlete in the world.
So super impressive. I remember even seeing him, as some of you may recall, on the cover of the Wheaties box. Amazing accomplishment. And of course, what a striking contrast. Bruce Jenner on the cover of Vanity Fair or shopping in Hollywood. It's a kind of like the ground is shifting under our feet feeling. So it has all gotten rather complicated, and this duck here, he says, just because I walk like a duck and I quack like a duck doesn't mean I identify as a duck. So we're being asked to sort of hold in abeyance or put into suspension our immediate impressions at times. So at one point in this interview on ABC News, Bruce Jenner was asked, "Are you a woman?" And let's listen to how he handles that question.
Are you a woman?
Yes, for all intents and purposes, I am a woman. People look at me differently. They see you as this macho male, but my heart and my soul and everything that I do in life, it is part of me. That female side is part of me. That's who I am.
Okay, so his answer, I think, is fairly typical of the way people approach this. He kind of says, my heart and soul, or my inner reality, is what you should attend to, and there I am feminine, etc. And so that's often the claim. There's a kind of separation between the body and the exterior and what the person declares regarding their core or essence. Often the language will be, I'm in the wrong body, when we'll hear something like that. Jenner and others facing gender dysphoria face the difficult cross of feeling trapped in the biological reality of a body discordant with their psychological self-identification. And when I say difficult cross, I think it's so important that we acknowledge this reality. This is something very, very serious in terms of the struggle that people encounter. You know, to think that you are actually a member of the opposite sex shows the kind of angst that one is dealing with. Should call forth a great deal of compassion on our part. Now, as this has been playing out in our culture, it has been raising, I think, a number of challenges. And it just reminds me of a conversation that I had one time with a priest friend of mine who is working as a Catholic chaplain at a secular university. And he said, you know, my first year as a chaplain, I set up a speaker's bureau, and I was inviting people to come in and give talks on different topics to the students, you know, at like the Newman Center. And he said, I made a big mistake. my first year. My mistake was that I invited somebody to come in and speak on the transgender issue as the first lecture of the lecture series. So what happened? All the students showed up, they sat down, they listened to this speaker, and, oh, this guy's just a bigot, and they left. And they didn't come back for subsequent lectures during the rest of the year. And he said to me, so I realized that our young people have bought into this hook, line, and sinker. 100% they've bought into it. And he said, I knew the way next year I had to do it was do all the other lectures first, and the very last one would be on transgender, because by that point I would have won the trust of the students and I'd be able to dialogue with them on this issue. So what these are, they're videos that were filmed on college campuses. And they're interviewing some of the college students, the young students, you know, bright future leaders potentially in our nation. And I'll share with you then some of the dialogue that occurred here that I think, you know, illuminates just how difficult it is even to talk about some very fundamental, foundational realities like men and women.
There's been a lot of talk about identity lately, but how far does it go? And is it possible to be wrong? We went to the University of Washington to find out.
Are you aware of the debate happening in Washington State around the ability to access bathrooms, locker rooms, spas based on gender identity and gender expression?
I think people should be able to have access to the facility.
I think people definitely should have the ability to go into whichever locker room they want.
You know, whether you identify as male or female and whether your sex at birth is matching to that, you should be able to utilize the resources.
So if I told you that I was a woman, what would your response be?
Good for you. Okay, like, yeah.
I don't have a problem with it.
If I told you that I was Chinese, what would your response be?
I mean, I might be a little surprised, but I would say, good for you. Like, yeah, be who you are. I would have a lot of questions, just because on the outside I would assume that you're a white man.
If I told you that I was 7 years old, what would your response be?
I probably wouldn't believe it, but I mean, it wouldn't really bother me that much to go out of my way and tell you, no, you're wrong. I'd just be like, oh, okay, he wants to say he's 7 years old.
If you feel 7 at heart, then then so be it. Yeah, good for you.
So if I wanted to enroll in a first grade class, do you think I should be allowed to?
Probably not, I guess. I mean, unless you haven't completed first grade up to this point and for some reason need to do that now.
If that's where you feel like mentally you should be, then I feel like there are communities that would accept you for that.
If I told you I'm 6 feet 5 inches, what would you say?
That I would question.
Why?
Because you're not. No, I don't think you're 6 foot 5.
So I can be a Chinese woman.
You. Sure.
But I can't be a 6'5" Chinese woman.
Yes.
If you truly believed you're 6'5", I don't think it's harmful. I think it's fine if you believe that. It doesn't matter to me if you think you're taller than you are.
So you'd be willing to tell me I'm wrong?
I wouldn't tell you you're wrong.
No, but I say that I don't think that you are.
No, I mean, I wouldn't just go like, oh, you're wrong, like that's wrong to believe in it, because I mean, again, it doesn't really bother me what you want to think about your height or anything.
I feel like that's not my place as like another human to say someone is wrong or to draw lines or boundaries.
Interestingly, you noticed that at one point he asks them, are you willing to tell anybody that they're wrong? And, oh, no, I would never tell anybody that they're wrong, about anything. But that's not true. I mean, any of these kids, if you cornered them and said, hey, when the turtles come up on the seashore and lay their eggs, is it okay? Is it, should you say nothing if somebody runs out there and stomps all over their eggs and kills the future generation of turtles? The kids would say, you should tell them that they're doing wrong. So they do have a very strong sense of morals, but it's very selective, and they have been mistrained or malformed around that moral sense in some very profound ways, regrettably. All of this does have practical ramifications, implications, when it comes to bathrooms and locker rooms. So we're beginning to see things like this, all gender restroom, or perhaps something like this. It's raising concerns on a number of fronts in terms of certain reasonable privacy concerns. And so I have a video here. This was from Pennsylvania, a public school. Very interesting that there was an individual who came out as transgender, and he said, I want to have access to the girls' locker room and other facilities, girls' bathrooms. And a small group of students at the school supported him. But then another group came out, larger group, and said, oh, wait a minute, no, this isn't right for him to be able to go into the girls' locker rooms.
First, it was parents at the most recent school board meeting for the Hillsborough R3 School District expressing their concern over a trans woman student using the girls' locker room. And today, it was a large group of students.
I love that I had so many people out there that went to counteract the people who walked out.
Around 200 walked out of class for nearly 2 hours at Hillsborough High School, 30 to 40 showing their support for senior Lila Perry to use the girls' locker room during gym.
There is a lot of ignorance. They are claiming that they're uncomfortable. I don't believe for a second they are. I think this is pure and simple bigotry.
Lila Perry was born a boy, but says she identified as a woman since age 13. Down the street from the school, two men who claimed they had relatives at the high school held signs.
Boys need to have their own locker room. Girls need to have their own locker room. If somebody has mixed feelings where they are, they need to have their own also.
Lila says school officials have been very accommodating, understanding, and compliant with Title IX federal law. To solve the controversy, they offered her a private, gender-neutral restroom. She turned it down.
I wasn't hurting anyone, and I didn't want to feel segregated out. I didn't want to be in the gender-neutral bathroom. I wanted to be... I am a girl. I shouldn't have to be pushed away and just off to another bathroom.
Some parents have asked if all this is an act by Lila to get in the girls' locker room. But a veteran gender therapist says gender identity is not a choice or a ruse.
So that's really important for many people to know and parents to know, that a person doesn't choose this. They really don't. And they know it very early, and they really are in a great deal of pain.
Out of concern for her safety, Lila Perry has dropped her PE class, but told me that she will continue to use the girls' bathroom at Hillsborough High School. Live in Hillsborough, Russell Kinsall, News 4.
So you notice at one point, Lila says something to the effect that, oh, well, people are saying that they're uncomfortable, but I don't believe that. This is bigotry, pure and simple, right? Well, first of all, it's interesting to claim that it doesn't seem like people are uncomfortable when you've just had half the school come out and protest and half the school on the other side. Clearly, there is some discomfort at play. But notice also, if we use an approach where we call certain people bigots, what's the effect of that? It's to shut down the dialogue, right? It's basically saying to us, you're not worthy to come and talk about this. You're not worthy to be public participants in this. You should simply be excluded. So that's unfair. That approach of using this highly polarizing language was used strategically in the same-sex debates as well, same-sex marriage and so on. But this is an unfair approach, and we need to insist and say, no, there are real goods that are at stake here that are very important, and we all need to be part of this dialogue. The government, as you recall, has gotten involved on various levels and is continuing to do so. The Departments of Justice and Education back in 2016, this was the Obama administration, sent a letter to every public school district in America threatening loss of federal funds if local districts did not adopt genderless bathroom policies, which would allow self-identified transgendered students to use facilities such as restrooms, showers, and locker rooms of the opposite biological sex. This is obviously a powerful bully pulpit, if you will, when you're threatening to take away federal funding unless there's perfect compliance. Here, it's so important that we identify authentic rights because, of course, those who are claiming to be transgender say, well, it's my right to use the same facilities as the opposite sex. We must safeguard the right not to be forced to be the object of another's sexual gaze. Opening intimate facilities to anyone of the opposite sex imposes psychosexual trauma on others and constitutes a form of sexual exploitation, and as such is clearly an unjust kind of a move. You know, I remember talking to a father one time, and he said something like this. He said, you know, I have all the feelings and sympathy in the world for these people who are struggling with identity and gender issues, but I just don't want the transgender football team showering with my daughters. And I think any father can understand that. And of course, these boundaries are very important to hold sacrosanct. So I want to introduce parallel cases, and I want to just think through a couple of examples with you. Many years ago, I was invited to come up to Anchorage, Alaska, and give a talk like this. It was to a small Catholic school. And I said, what do you want me to talk on? And they said, transgender issues. And I said, well, are you sure? You know, this is really controversial, and this is, you know, high school. And they said, oh yeah. And they said, the way we're going to do this, we're going to send home to all the parents an announcement about your talk. We're going to require that they, you know, sign the dotted line and agree to let their kids attend. And we're going to open it up so that the parents themselves can come to your talk as well. And I said, that's great. You know, I love it when this stuff is totally transparent. So that's exactly what they did. All the parents allowed their kids to participate, and some of the parents themselves did show up, so it was very nice. And I used this example, and actually the kids had read one of my columns where I deal with this particular example. And they said, you know, they found this to be so helpful, so I hope you will as well. So basically, here is how the example goes. Imagine that you are in some new environment. Maybe you're at a dinner party, and you're meeting people who you've never met before, and you meet a particular individual, and you start talking with him. And as the conversation moves forward, at a certain point, he kind of surprises you. And he says, a little bit out of the blue, you know, in my heart of hearts, I was actually born a pirate. And you're kind of, you know, scratching your head as he says this. And he goes on and he says, you know, this is so fully my identity as a pirate that I have recently gone to my healthcare team and I've spoken with them and I have said that it is imperative they must remove one of my hands so that I can have a hook installed, and they have to surgically remove one of my legs so that I can become Peg Leg Pete. And even I'm talking with them about removing an eyeball so that I can wear a patch and be who I truly am in my innermost identity. Now, if any physician, if any medical professional were to agree to do any of these interventions, these mutilations, he would be chased out of the medical field, right, with malpractice. However, offered the opportunity to remove healthy genitalia, regrettably, the medical profession capitulates to the gender ideology and agrees to harm patients. And this is one of the great tragedies. And the tragedy is extending further because now this is beginning to be allowed on very young children. And at times then with permanent implications for their fertility and for their entire future life, tragically. So I want to introduce here Dr. Paul McHugh, very important player in this discussion and debate. He was the psychiatrist in chief at the Johns Hopkins Hospital Psychiatry Department for many years. He wrote an important article called Surgical Sex in the November 2004 of First Things. It's still available online. A great read. He's an excellent writer as well. And I'm going to share with you kind of the gist of his conclusions. What happened was he became psychiatrist in chief at Johns Hopkins Hospital, so he was under a lot of pressure to keep the sex change surgeries going in the very department that had originally proposed these. But he was like, well, wait a minute, don't we need to talk about this a little bit? He said, I decided to challenge what I considered to be a misdirection of psychiatry and to demand more information, both before and after their operations. I wanted to test the claim that men who had undergone sex change surgery found resolution for their many general psychological problems. Now that seems fair, right? You're doing something really radical here. You're doing some incredible surgeries, and you're saying this better be curative. This better help out with all these psychological problems that these guys are presenting with. So this is just kind of, evidence-based medicine that we're asking for. Very reasonable. So he said men, and until recently they were all men with whom I spoke before their surgery, would tell me that their bodies and sexual identities were at variance. Those I met after surgery would tell me that the surgery and hormone treatments that had made them women had also made them happy and contented. None of these encounters were persuasive, however. The post-surgical subjects struck me as caricatures of women. They wore high heels, copious makeup, and flamboyant clothing. They spoke about how they found themselves able to give vent to their natural inclinations for peace, domesticity, and gentleness. But their large hands, prominent Adam's apples, and thick facial features were incongruous and would become more so as they aged. So a couple of observations here. First, you notice this reference to peace, domesticity, and gentleness. It's kind of like somehow this is the quintessence of femininity, right? And these guys are tuning into that. But Dr. McHugh pointed out that in all the men that he had worked with over the years who were claiming, to need to transition, he said there was one thing that they had no interest in. I mean, they were glad to talk to you about various sexual proclivities that they had, other things like that. But the one thing they had no interest in was babies. He said, now isn't that, kind of a surprise here? And notice here his reference to the large hands, prominent Adam's apples. So it's turning out, that when you do these surgeries, they're getting more and more sophisticated, and it's true that certainly in the early days, you usually could tell after the passage of time whether somebody was transgender and whether they had undergone these treatments. But what's happening now, for example, they can shave down the Adam's apple and make it stick out less. There's no surgery that I'm aware of for large hands yet, but I suspect somebody is working on it. These surgeries are getting very, very sophisticated and very, very expensive. So in following up on these sex change surgeries, most of the men reported being content with what they had done years after their surgery. Only a few regretted it. But in every other respect, he noted, they were little changed in their psychological condition. They had largely the same problems with relationships, work, and emotions as before. So he concludes, with these facts in hand, I concluded that Hopkins was fundamentally cooperating with a mental illness. Now, as you can imagine, that did not make him popular. This kind of conclusion has made him an unwelcome individual, and he's been regularly pilloried and beaten up on the internet by advocates. He goes on and he says, we psychiatrists, I thought, would do better to concentrate on trying to fix their minds and not their genitalia. Very, sound and rational kind of a conclusion, but not popular. I'm going to mention some very important players here. They're called detransitioners, and they regret having transitioned. And I want to just share with you one example, rather famous one, Walt Heyer. He has set up a website called sexchangeregret.com. When he was 3 years old, he was marched around by his grandmother, and she had already dressed him up in a purple chiffon dress. And she said to him, "Oh, you're such a beautiful little girl." And she would do this over and over whenever he would come visit. And then she would say to him, "Don't you tell anybody else in the family what you and I are doing here. This is our little secret." Can you believe it? What kind of terrible child abuse. And then later, when he was, I think, 12 or 13, he was raped by his baseball coach. So, he had all kinds of things going on that were throwing him off kilter. And he struggled with this, with cross-dressing, other issues. He did actually get married and had kids, but whenever he worked for Honda Motor Corporation as an engineer, whenever he would travel to other places, to other cities, he would secretly cross-dress and, kind of try to live out his fantasy. Then he bumped into a surgeon who said, "Oh yeah, we need to transition you." And he did the surgeries and the hormones, and it was, very radical. And then he had this long process of journeying with a Protestant church where they worked with him, received him, helped him, supported him, and eventually he realized, wow, what I did was really wrong. And he's done everything he can to, reverse, but of course some of the damage is permanent. So he says, to a person undergoing gender transition in the beginning, it feels like the right thing to do, even exciting for the first few months or years. I felt at peace for the first 4 or 5 years after I transitioned. Then I realized the high cost of that tenuous peace. Being transgender required destroying the identity of Walt, so my female persona, Laura, would feel unshackled from Walt's past with all of its hurt, shame, and abuse. It's a marvelous distraction for a while, but it isn't a permanent solution when the underlying issues remain unaddressed. And that's been a constant theme of his talks. He travels around the country and speaks on this. And he says we need to address the underlying issues. Don't just do surgeries. That's not going to solve things. He says gender change is at its heart a self-destructive act. Transgenders not only annihilate their birth identity, they destroy everyone and everything in their wake: family, wife, children, brothers or sisters, and career. And that's exactly what happened to him. He got fired from Honda Motor Corporation. He lived on the street for a while as a homeless person before the Protestant church reached out to him and drew him in. Okay, before I play this video, it's worth mentioning also that Walt ended up getting divorced from his wife. She couldn't live with him anymore when she understood what he was going through, and his children basically refused to talk to him. So it was like, a lot of times it's often as if an atom bomb goes off in the middle of the family. I have another example of that here.
Good evening. Yeah, it is a victory for her tonight. In fact, her attorneys and her doctor are scrambling this evening to get that judge's order in writing so she can proceed with that surgery. The surgery actually scheduled for yesterday here in Bucks County, but that's where things get messy. Her parents wanting a delay, raising issues like past alcohol abuse and her HIV status. And for the transgender community, raising questions about family and the law. The tall blonde in the dress and heels is Christine Kitzler. Are you surprised that this actually ended up in court?
I am shocked.
By now, she expected to be in recovery from gender reassignment surgery.
When I was 8 years old or so, I knew something was majorly wrong. It was like an empty feeling.
Christine McGinn is her doctor.
We began the beginning of the week in a routine manner. You know, I called Christine, we made sure she was ready for surgery, and then all of a sudden, I walk into my office on Monday and her parents are in my office.
So instead, it was a day in court with parents who know her as Christopher, fighting for a guardianship order and a mental evaluation.
These are loving and caring parents who drove from Cleveland, Ohio to be here because they wanted to make certain that their son was making an informed and conscious, safe decision.
The judge rejected their plea, leaving the decision on Christine's future up to her.
I'm not like surprised or anything because I know that this is right. I mean, it's just right.
Both her attorney and her doctor tell me they have not seen a case like this before, which is why it was being watched so closely. Now, this is a family that had been very close, but clearly now things are strained. The father saying in court at one point today that he wishes he could have a son back who went to church with them on Sundays. Live in Doylestown, I'm Lauren Make, NBC 10.
You notice at one point, Christopher says, when I was 8 years old, I knew something was majorly wrong. And again, you know, that's a very candid admission on his part and a reminder to us of the depth of the struggles that these people are facing. And we shouldn't shortchange them by offering them surgical and hormonal approaches when they need something much more. So Walt concludes, it occurred to me after much self-reflection that asking a surgeon to modify my appearance through a series of cosmetic procedures was simply a socially acceptable means of self-mutilation and self-destruction. Taken to the extreme, self-destruction leads to suicide. And there have been, you know, I mean, this is, when you think of what a transgender person is doing, they're trying to escape on some level from who they were born as and assume a completely different type of identity or personality. So, as he says, taken to the extreme, it leads to suicide. And one of the problems is that in this population, tragically, there's a very high level of suicide. And one of the claims has been, oh, so therefore we need to do surgeries because unless we do surgeries and offer them this, they're going to kill themselves. So again, Dr. McHugh and other researchers have said, well, this means that, you know, if you're going to be doing this, we should be able to show that the suicide rate is going to return to at least the rate of suicide among the general population. That turns out to be false. There was an important study that was done in Sweden in 2011, looked at the risks for sex reassignment surgery. There was a 20-fold suicide mortality post-surgical, 20 times higher than for the general population. So this didn't cure anything. Depression and low quality of life also followed. And there were other elevated risks of psychiatric hospitalization. So it's a real tragedy, but again, we have to be careful not to put a false Band-Aid on. All right, a little bit about patterns of transgenderism. Researchers report 3 patterns. One is males with childhood gender dysphoria, who are usually sexually attracted to men, so homosexual. There are secret transvestites, also known by some researchers as autogynephiles, and this is probably the case for Bruce Jenner. So what happens is these individuals cross-dress as women, and they are aroused sexually by looking at themselves in the mirror, you know, as they cross-dress. So they're autogynephiles. And the third category would be females with childhood gender dysphoria, who are usually sexually attracted to women, so they are lesbians. These are the 3 large categories. So passing as the other sex, as I said, the surgeries are getting better. It's getting harder to tell sometimes whether somebody is transgender. Leads to complex pastoral situations. She asks, would you like to see a picture of me before the operation, just married, and you see his eyeballs are kind of bugging out. Very significant concerns of this type. And also, as you can surmise, questions around ordination, because only a baptized biological male may receive orders. Birth sex is key to eligibility. And mutilation would be an irregularity for men who have surgically transitioned, then repented that act. Women pretending to be men have been unknowingly admitted to Catholic seminaries, though thankfully they were discovered prior to being ordained, prior to receiving holy orders. So you can see the kinds of complexities. What if you have a little boy who's transitioning and he says he wants to wear the first communion dress in the parish, etc. So how should we respond? What are psychiatrists and health professionals to do? Although they may have to decline to take the patient's claims at face value, they must still recognize, without dismissing it in any way, the seriousness and reality of their distress. This can't be overemphasized. And the unacceptability of harassment, discrimination, ridicule, and bullying. These only make the situation worse. We have to protect people from this injustice. Those with gender dysphoria need evidence-based care. Dr. McHugh, in a Wall Street Journal article, summed it up this way: the treatment should strive to correct the false, problematic nature of the assumption and to resolve the psychosocial conflicts provoking it. With youngsters, this is best done in family therapy. So psychotherapy, appropriate psychotherapy, is so important. And Walt Heyer just, blares this from the mountaintops every opportunity that he gets. And he himself has gone through very, very extensive and helpful psychotherapy. So family support, family therapy, and other psychotherapy lead to successful treatment. All right, so pastorally, what can we do as Catholics? And we'll wrap up here. Remember that God is loving each person where they are and calling them to holiness. Welcome and accompany persons spiritually. Foster full human development for them. Affirm the person, but not all their choices. Anyone who's raised children understands the importance of that. Charitably challenge false assumptions about truth and reality. And understand, of course, that our Lord Jesus Christ accepts all of us with all of our flaws and weaknesses, as he most certainly does. All right, this woman is from a group called canavox.com, and they've been putting together a number of good videos, and this is a very short video where she talks about how a mother talks to her kids about transgender. And I think she does a nice job here.
Here's what happened. One of her kids mentioned transgender at the dinner table. There was a mix of ages between 4 through 14 in front of her, so she kept it simple. She reminded them that they either have boy parts or girl parts. If they have boy parts, they have a boy body, and that means they are a boy. If they have girl parts, they have a girl body, and that means they are a girl. Being a girl doesn't mean that you have to love pink and princesses, and being a boy doesn't mean that you have to love frogs and guns. There are lots of different personality traits and interests that boys and girls can have. But being a boy or being a girl is much more basic than any of that. This mom assured her kids that they never need to worry about what they are. Just look to their bodies for the answer. Now, she also had a 12 and 14-year-old in front of her, so she followed up with them in a private conversation. To them, she explained that there are some people who call themselves transgender, who are uncomfortable with being either male or female. In their mind, they believe they are the opposite sex, and they may say things like, "I'm a boy trapped in a girl's body." But the reality is that biologically speaking, they are indeed male or female. It's just that mentally, for reasons we don't always know, they struggle to accept their biology. We should be very compassionate towards these people, but also hope that they can find a good therapist who can help them embrace the amazing design of their bodies.
Great summary, huh? And also so age appropriate, you know, that she speaks to the younger kids a different way than she speaks to the older ones. Very, very important. All right, my last slide here. I think that the transgender proposal really stretches reason. You know, it pushes against reason so hard that even liberals are pushing back. How many of you are familiar with this woman? Her name is Camille Paglia, or Paglia. How many of you have ever heard of her? Okay, just a few. She's very liberal. She's pro-abortion, she's pro-contraception. However, she is extremely intelligent, and I do read some of her articles. I remember I read an article that she wrote on the state of higher education in the United States, and I read it and I was saying to myself, yes, yes, yes. You know, she just nailed the issues one after another. So she was interviewed, look at the title of this, on Trump, Democrats, Transgenderism, and Islamist Terror. So they covered a lot of ground in this interview. So what did Camille Paglia have to say here? I think some words of sanity. The cold biological truth is that sex changes are impossible. Every single cell of the human body remains coded with one's birth gender for life. Intersex ambiguities can occur, but they are developmental anomalies that represent a tiny proportion of all human births. So a good note to close on. And I want to just quickly mention some references as we gather your cards for the Q&A. My website, fathertad.com, our bioethics center, ncbcenter.org. So we'll stop there and start our Q&A.
Thank you very much, Father Tad.
Thank you.
Okay. Be sure and pass your questions to the ladies with the scarves. I'm just going to jump right into it.
Okay.
How do these so-called institutions of higher learning and their professors justify indoctrinating these young people?
Let me tell you what I think has happened here. In our universities, in the ivory tower, there have been discussions for decades going on about transgender issues. And really it never sort of hit the mainstream until quite recently. It came out of our universities full force, and now we see it, you know, permeating throughout the culture. So I think what happened is that the university professors who were studying these issues made the decision that this is now something that's ready for prime time and are pushing it, you know, very, very strongly, and young people are buying into it, as we said, very energetically.
Are there any other dysphorias like gender dysphoria?
Okay, there are other dysphorias. There are other psychiatric conditions where people experience severe distress because they're convinced that they should be another way. And there's actually a video, I have it. I didn't incorporate it in this presentation because it's a little longer, but it's of a young woman who's convinced that she is supposed to have been born blind. And so she learned to read Braille. She would put on dark glasses and walk around with a white stick and try to maneuver without seeing. And finally she went to her doctor and asked him to make her blind, believe it or not. And she found some doctor somewhere who advised her to pour bleach into her eyes, which she did, and it caused significant, almost complete blindness, tragically. So this is another example of a dysphoria, and there are other ones as well where people believe they're supposed to have been born without a limb, and they want those limbs removed, etc.
Are there any medical or psychological societies that still consider transgenderism a mental disorder, or is the scientific community monolithic in accepting it?
Well, it's almost monolithic. I mentioned the American, let's see, what was the exact title? I want to get it right. College of Pediatricians. But it tends to be like this, that you have smaller groups of physicians who are aggregating together and saying, hey, the mainstream here has got it all wrong, and we're going to set up an alternative. So it's almost monolithic.
If your kids' friends ask them to call them by a pronoun that does not correspond to their biological sex, what should they do? And also, another one, I work for the state of Texas institution, and the transgender agenda is forced upon us employees. I am not free to speak the truth for fear of losing my job. To get around the transgender titles, I call people by their preferred first name. Do you have any advice for when confronted with this issue, how should we respond?
Okay, so the pronoun issue. Let me tell you a little story that I think will indicate there's sort of different ways that we need to be thinking about this. Dr. John Haas, our former president of the National Catholic Bioethics Center in Philadelphia, where I work, one time went to Chicago, and he was part of a meeting on bioethics. And part of what they had to do, they had a table up on the podium here, and they were going to have a panel discussion. So he sat down at the table, and next to him, this very attractive blonde woman sat down. And a few minutes later, he looked over at her, and he looked at her hands, and suddenly he realized that she was actually a he. Now, he said to all of us at the center, he said, you know, in that moment, if I had used the proper pronoun for this individual and called him a he, it would have been like, again, a nuclear bomb going off. The whole conference would have probably had to shut down. Wouldn't have been possible to have our session here. So he said, you know, I didn't use the wrong pronoun. And sometimes there are strategies, as was mentioned in the question, where you just use a first name to avoid the problem of pronouns. So I want you to contrast that with this situation. You are a teacher in a Catholic high school. In the 9th grade, you teach this particular young man a class. 10th grade, turns out you also get him. 11th grade, you switch over and you're teaching PE, physical education, and you also happen to teach him. And at the end of the year, as a junior in high school, he comes to you and he says, during this summer, I'm going to transition and I'm going to become a girl. And when I come back next year as a senior in high school, I want you to use the female pronouns to talk to me. Now, how should we respond to that? Well, that's very different, right? You have a relationship with this kid. You know him, you've taught him for 3 years. This should be a moment of opportunity for you to say, hey, wait a minute. I know you think it's going to be uncomfortable for you if I call you by the wrong pronouns, but you know what? If you force me to use the wrong pronouns to address you, don't you understand how uncomfortable I will be? And I need to talk with you about this, and maybe we should get together with your mom and dad and talk about this as well. So, you know, there's an opportunity because you have an ongoing relationship with somebody like him that we need to share the truth versus those other situations where you casually meet somebody in passing. You may not have an opportunity to do that, and it may not be the right moment to do it either. So that would be the pronoun question. You know, the question of working for the state of Texas, yeah, I mean, you've got to be very careful in how you navigate this and choose your language carefully, but you don't want to speak, you know, directly and intentionally, sort of untruthfully and playing into a fiction, even if the state itself may be coercing people in that direction.
We're actually out of time for this question and answer. Maybe perhaps at the end we could have some of these questions addressed at the very end of the conference.
Absolutely, that'd be great. Well, thank you all so much.